Welcome to this explainer. When we think about the energy sector and drilling for oil, we usually focus on the geology, the complex science of what's happening miles beneath our feet. But today, we're exploring a fascinating reality. It's actually about the geography, the politics, and the human impact happening right on the surface. We're going to dive into the strict mathematical ways the industry measures these above-ground risks. Because, as we'll see, the absolute biggest threat to a multi-million-dollar project usually isn't a dry well. It's what's going on around it. We're going to look specifically at how to quantify the percentage of reserves in active conflict areas, how to handle corruption indexes, and how to track the frequency and duration of non-technical delays. It is literally a masterclass in turning complex social friction into hard, actionable data. So, what actually stops an oil drill in its tracks? Our minds naturally go straight to the physical engineering, right? We picture broken drill bits, massive pressure failures, or just the crushing disappointment of tapping a dry well. But we really need to pivot our attention upward. In reality, some of the most profound, costly threats to an exploration and production entity don't require a hard hat to see. We're talking about local community protests physically blocking access roads, sudden geopolitical conflicts erupting overnight, and the silent, corrosive spread of corruption through local governments. These above-ground factors, they can freeze a billion-dollar project way faster than any geological anomaly ever could. Here is our quick roadmap for today. We'll be looking at how to move beyond environmental risks, quantify active conflict, track non-technical delays, measure corruption exposure, and finally, we'll wrap up with the ultimate value of all this transparency. Let's get right into it. Okay, Section 1, Beyond Environmental Risks. The source material drops a pretty stark truth right out of the gate. The most oil-rich well on the planet is practically worthless if it's trapped in a war zone or if a local community has successfully suspended its permits. Operating in areas with weak governance, a lack of rule of law, or right next to highly vulnerable communities exposes companies to massive, largely uninsurable costs. We are talking about forced settlement payments to aggrieved parties, exorbitant private security costs just to protect personnel, and ultimately, huge write-downs in the value of those reserves on the balance sheet. Think about it. If the oil is in the ground but the surface is completely inaccessible because of community backlash or political instability, those assets essentially become stranded. It's a purely financial crisis born entirely from human factors. So, how do we handle that? Let's move to Section 2, Quantifying Active Conflict. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. How do you begin to put a reliable, auditable number on something as chaotic as a war? Well, ESG reporting takes a highly subjective, emotionally charged word like conflict and anchors it to a strict mathematical third-party definition. According to the UPFLA Conflict Data Program, a conflict is deemed active if there are at least 25 battle-related deaths per calendar year in one of the conflict's dyads. A dyad just means two specific opposing armed groups, like a government fighting a rebel faction or two rival militias clashing. This brilliantly removes all the guesswork and corporate spin. You don't get to debate whether it's just a minor skirmish or a localized dispute. If the violence hits that tragic 25-death threshold between those two opposing forces in a single year, it's officially an active conflict. Full stop. But wait, how close to the fighting does your oil well actually have to be considered at risk? The SASB standard draws a shockingly wide circle here. You must include your proved and probable reserves if they are located anywhere in the exact same country as the active conflict. The only way out of this reporting requirement? You, the reporting company, have to definitively prove that the conflict is strictly contained to a specific region miles away from your operations, with absolutely zero chance of affecting your supply chain, your personnel, or your export routes. The burden of proof is entirely on the operator to justify an exclusion. Otherwise, the entire country and every asset you have in it is fully in scope. And the math to report this is elegantly simple yet profoundly revealing. You just take the total volume of your reserves located in that specific conflict zone and divide it by your total global volume of reserves. You run this calculation twice. Once for your proved reserves, the oil you are almost certain is commercially recoverable, and once for your probable reserves, which are a bit less certain. The end result strips away all the PR fluff and hands your investors a hard, undeniable percentage of your portfolio currently sitting in a war zone. It tells an investor exactly how much of their capital is exposed to the threat of kinetic warfare, boiling a massive geopolitical crisis down to a single, easily digestible fraction. Moving right along to Section 3, Tracking Non-Technical Delays. Of course, operating in these high-risk areas often leads to real-world operational halts, where production just grinds to a standstill. And it's absolutely vital for companies to clearly separate their standard day-to-day operational hurdles from the above-ground risks we're discussing today. If a freak winter storm rolls in, or a high-pressure drill bit snaps deep underground, that's just a technical delay. It's the cost of doing business in a rugged industry. But a shutdown caused entirely by social, political, or governance friction, that's a non-technical delay. It requires its own dedicated tracking because it signals a totally different kind of systemic risk to your investors. You can usually engineer your way out of a broken pipe, but you can't always engineer your way out of a broken relationship with a host government or an angry local municipality. So what exactly triggers this specific reporting requirement? It covers a clearly defined scope of disruptions. It kicks in if you're forced to sit idle, waiting on a government to issue a pending environmental or operational permit. It triggers if you're caught up in bureaucratic political delays, like election year stonewalling. It also immediately triggers if local stakeholders are actively protesting and physically blocking your site's access gates. And, like we just discussed, it triggers if armed conflict or severe security threats force you to evacuate your drilling crews. Basically, any event where the human element forces the machinery to turn off falls right into this bucket. When these disruptions happen, you're required to report two distinct data points. First, the frequency. What is the total absolute number of site shutdowns you experienced over the reporting period? And second, the total duration. Exactly how many cumulative days did these non-technical factors delay your projects? Tracking both the occurrences and the lost time is brilliant. It gives a perfect snapshot of the company's operating reality. It shows an investor whether a company is facing one massive, drawn-out, 6-month standoff with a community, or a constant, exhausting barrage of 50 separate one-day delays caused by endless regulatory friction. The frequency shows the volatility, while the total duration shows the ultimate financial bleed.
Next up, Section 4, Measuring Corruption Exposure.
Beyond kinetic conflict and vocal community protests, we also have to evaluate a more silent, systemic operational killer: exposure to corruption and bribery. In the exploration and production industry, relationships with sovereign governments and local officials are absolutely critical. Why? Because entities are in constant, fierce, high-stakes competition for access to lucrative, state-owned oil and gas reserves. The contracts are massive, the regulatory approvals are complex, and the potential profits are staggering. That intense competition for access can easily breed the temptation for bribery and unethical back-channel deals. So how do we actually quantify that temptation and that risk for an external investor looking at a balance sheet? The magic number here is 20. To accurately quantify this risk, companies must calculate the percentage of their reserves located in countries that hold the 20 lowest rankings on Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, or CPI. Now, if you aren't familiar with it, this index is effectively the global gold standard for scoring how corrupt a country's public sector is perceived to be. It aggregates data from experts and business people worldwide, providing a highly respected, independent benchmark. If you have significant assets concentrated in those bottom-ranked nations, well, your corruption risk profile skyrockets. Actually, there's a critical, easily overlooked detail about how this index works, a trap that trips up a lot of initial reporting. Countries frequently tie for a numerical rank. Because multiple nations can share a single rank at the absolute bottom of the list, your reporting scope might actually pull in well over 20 actual nations. You have to look at the lowest 20 numerical ranks themselves, not just blindly count out the bottom 20 countries on the map. It's a strict, unforgiving requirement designed specifically to prevent companies from exploiting loopholes and underreporting their true exposure to corrupt regimes. Once again, we apply the exact same elegant formula structure we used for active conflict zones to turn a highly qualitative, shadowy risk, like government corruption, into a hard, auditable percentage. You take the total volume of your proved and probable reserves sitting in those lowest-ranking CPI nations, and you divide it by your total global reserves. It's an incredible standardization tool. It quite literally turns ethics into math, allowing asset managers in New York or London to objectively compare the governance risk of a driller in West Africa against a driller in South America, all using the exact same denominator. Let's wrap things up with Section 5, the value of transparency. So why go through all this complex math in the first place? Well, by translating these abstract human risks into hard, comparable data, companies can prove to the market that they aren't just drilling blindly with their fingers crossed. They are showing that they actively and meticulously manage their operational environment. Doing this early and accurately prevents those massive sudden write-downs in reserve values because the risk is already recognized and priced in. Furthermore, it protects a company's crucial social license to operate, which is the ongoing acceptance of standard business practices by employees, local stakeholders, and the general public. And most importantly, it highlights proactive risk management to compliance officers and ESG investors who demand absolute certainty that their money isn't inadvertently funding local corruption, violating rights, or sitting stranded and idle in a dangerous war zone. As you review your own organizational reporting practices and methodologies moving forward, I want to leave you with this final thought to really chew on. Are you accurately quantifying the unpredictable human risks happening above the ground before you spend millions drilling for the value below it? It's a question that separates the industry leaders from the laggards. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep looking beyond the surface, and I'll catch you on the next one.